So Donny, despite the fact that you are a Tokyo-based digital marketing and PR maverick, that's actually not why people know you, right? They don't know you for that at all. They predominantly kind of know you in your travel blogger role. Can you talk to us firstly about how that happened and how's life as a travel blogger in COVID-19?
That's an interesting question because in my mind, they're basically the same thing. Okay. So to understand what I do with travel, I think you need to kind of understand how I even got into it in the beginning. Being someone in the agency world, it's really easy to, do a lot of really cool things and have no recognition for it or no kind of like lasting resume that shows outwardly. So what I did is I decided to one day just start storytelling about all of the more rural or unknown destinations in Japan as a means of creating a sandbox environment for myself to basically A/B test things that I read on the internet that may or may not work and might not be something I would just roll out on a client account. So I started this project after, seeing. I think it was during Golden Week and I was traveling somewhere in Japan and I got a flyer and I was like, no one wants this. And I just decided to start doing marketing for all of these local destinations, just thinking I could do it better. And in doing so, I could, kind of figure out the ins and outs of storytelling better and by making my own content and being in the trenches, have more context about how all this works rather than just being that guy at the agency. And, just over 4 years of just doing it week after week after week, it's blown up to what it is. But very much I view it as just not something that is, of course the travel part is something that's integral to my identity, but in many instances it's just a way for me to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and have a lot more context to what I discuss with brands and my clients.
Mentioned it's blown up to what it is. Can you give us a current overview of what your social media reach is right now?
So right now we're in a bit of a weird place because of coronavirus in terms of web traffic. The people are searching for Japan related stuff is certainly down. I think I'm down around like half of what it was pre-COVID-19. So we're around, I think 150,000 unique users, which mostly comes from ranking for places like Atami or other sort of, less popular but still known destinations. Facebook, I mean, it's 45,000, but that doesn't really matter because organic reach on Facebook is a thing in the past to begin with. Twitter is around 40,000 as well. Instagram, I think we just crossed the 75,000 mark, and then I'm right now going hard on TikTok growth. That's at around 12,000.
The reason why I just kind of wanted to firstly frame that is just to give people an idea that you've certainly done the research and you've certainly put in, you've been in the weeds when it comes to social media. You use the apps yourselves. You yourself. You don't, have a social media marketing manager or something like that.
Right.
You do it yourself. So anything that we're talking about today is what you have seen. So for our listeners, this is not necessarily advice. This is just something that we've seen that's working right now today. And as we know with everything in technology and social media, that it might not work tomorrow. So please take this as where we are today.
We're going into August 2020. By probably September 2020, all of this will be irrelevant. So you get a 1 month window.
Exactly. So what's really interesting about your particular role in Japan is not only do you have your travel blogger or travel influencer profile, but you also work in an agency, which is a really interesting dynamic because we've seen that it's kind of like one or the other, but you've been able to kind of find the magic middle. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that came to be and what it's like managing those two profiles?
So before I alluded to the fact that being in an agency, it's easy to just be the invisible cog. So I've been in the agency longer than I've been doing this. I think I'm now going on year 8 in the agency. And about 3 or 4 years in, I handled the launch of one of the largest streaming platforms in the world. I, of course, won't say the exact name, but you could probably surmise what it was just by reverse engineering the dates. And that was a very fun and fulfilling process, but I had nothing to my name to show for it. And after, pulling several all-nighters in the lead up to the launch press conference, I realized this was, interesting, but it wasn't enough. So that's why I went and launched all of these channels shortly thereafter. But I mean, balancing the two has been hard. In many ways, what I've been doing is taking best practices and being on the cutting edge of algorithmic changes, and then trying to bring that into a Japanese world, which often lags several years behind where the global platforms are in terms of changes and in terms of understanding. So, for example, I alluded to before the concept of organic reach, or how many people you can reach without paying a single yen. That's basically zero right now on Facebook, but the number of Japanese people who probably understand that is, of course, increasing. But I would say that a lot of Japanese people still don't understand that concept that I have to pay to reach my following on Facebook. It just it doesn't make sense to them, because their usage context is basically their profile that they have 3 friends on or whatever, or that they use as a business networking profile. They don't understand the difference between user profiles and business pages. All this kind of context is lacking. So a lot of what I've been doing is trying to translate those learnings into something that we can use in terms of our clients. But it's a struggle.
Imagine. If we think about that gap, right, that you were talking about, that exists, obviously, there's no one particular reason, but if you were to kind of give your personal view or your personal lens on what are the kind of contributing factors, where are the barriers?
I would say that there's a strong adherence to the way that things have been done, or that the way that things should work in a ideal textbook type of world. So, for example, one discussion I recently had was for one client's campaign, one of our Japanese, rather domestically minded staff wanted to do kind of the charcuterie board of media buys. So we do some on Facebook, some on Instagram, some online, some on Smart News, which is a news app that a lot of Japanese people follow, some on Yahoo, some on Google, just a little, let's hit everything, right? And while he's kind of correct from an academic standpoint of, yes, there's a lot of attention all these different places, there's also kind of the contextual side of things of okay, the creative we have is limited. We can't edit it. It's very video heavy, so therefore things like banners aren't going to perform so well. Moreover, as a user who's aware of their own behavior, when's the last time anyone's even clicked a banner? But by being in the trenches, you kind of gain context on all these things, which kind of then allow you to better interpret the ideal situation that I guess would be in the textbook. So without that context, it's really hard to judge. And by being in it, I've been able to see, okay, this works here, here, and here, but that's not going to work there, there, or there because X, Y, Z. And I have all those reference experiences from just being in it on my own, that I can then better make sense of the situation. But without that, you kind of default to how things should be, but it doesn't necessarily fit to the particular case, if that makes sense.
Thinking about context, right? Context is really developed through a deeper understanding of people and psychology. And you almost went on to do a doctorate in psychology, right?
Kind of. So I have officially a master's in, I guess what you call social psychology. It's technically in Japanese studies. But basically what I was doing, I was looking at the Japanese people who have rejected the narrative of, Tanaka the salaryman, and how they're negotiating identity in basically a post-bubble world. Because what I think we're seeing, and this kind of ties into what we're talking, is that reality and the Japanese kind of operating system of how things should be, that we're seeing more and more schisms appear. So a good example might be is that there are not enough seishain positions to really go around anymore. A lot of people are coming in as kayak shain, which would be contract workers, or they're coming in as like hatgen, which would be like a temporary dispatch. Because of all of this, there's more and more ripples appearing in society. So one example might be is a lot of times when going to rent an apartment, they want to know if you're seishain at a certain place. So if you don't have that kind of permanency, you can be harder to rent an apartment in certain areas, especially areas that where the apartment might be a little bit more, let's say, upscale, or the area might be a little bit more wealthy. Is you're going to kind of have a lot of kickback if you're just a hucking temporary dispatch worker. But the problem is the economic reality of the situation has moved away from the Japanese kind of cultural trope of like this job for life kind of thing. So we still have the echoes of this now dead cultural trope, but reality's gone this way, if that makes sense. It's quite hard to explain in just like a few short words, but we're seeing schisms like this appear all across as reality is accelerating at a pace far faster than Japanese kind of cultural archetypes and whatnot are changing.
This is exactly kind of the path that I wanted to explore a little more, because one of the reasons that this podcast exists is to create or really even just document the modern state of Japan. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of perhaps studies or theory or academia, around that kind of, Japan is number one, that bubble period. But once the bubble burst, we haven't really had a lot of content about what it means to do business in Japan, what it means to tell a successful story in Japan, apart from, okay, everyone, make sure you have your meishi, which is your business card. And you're like, okay, well, that's, really great. But at the end of the day, what do I do after I've exchanged my meishi? You know what I mean? What do we talk about? What are the kind of challenges that I'm looking at? So if we go back to that, what kind of began in your academic career. So obviously, you took a different path, and then you decided to pursue your marketing, your marketing passions, and then that obviously turned into also an incredible side career at the same time, as a travel blogger. But that was kind of rooted in that, academia and that research that you've done about like the psychology of people. And so kind of once the bubble burst, and, we have these systems that are in place, and this is true of social media, but it's also true of economics in general, that we look at, okay, how long does Japan keep playing the same game when the game's over, right? And so this is kind of what I'm interested in, because you've been able to, and I know that you've used your own profile as kind of like a test case. So your company hasn't been able, didn't need to take the risk. You took the risk yourself, and you came back with success stories. And then they said, okay, well, let's go and do what you suggested, because it didn't fail. Talk to us a little bit about navigating that environment of exactly what you mentioned, those cultural archetypes that exist of kind of the no, but at the same time, reality and social media and technology is not waiting for Japan to change.
Yeah, just backing up real quick to the academia days. It's funny because I never actually was interested in marketing until I joined the agency. I was very much an ivory tower academic, had a bit of a family issue that I had to put studies on hold for a bit, and then I came back and realized no one really is going to hire someone with a doctorate in deviant use psychology, and realized that my options were basically becoming like a fossilized academic in some like rural, like Gifu University or something. No offense to Gifu, it's just I prefer to live in Tokyo. And then I realized, okay, like I think it's time to figure out what the hell I'm going to do with my life, and basically had an opening at where I'm at right now, and it just came in basically at the beginning just to be a kind of an interface between overseas clients and our domestic staff, and then just what I do now grew out of that, very much organically, because you mentioned about like this schism between Japan holding on to something that's dead in the current reality. But I mean that's basically all I've been doing is navigating this, is because I was the first foreigner ever to be on one of our account teams. We've had foreigners before, but they've been like dedicated English checker to like fix Tanaka-san's bad English. But I was the first person
no
to ever
input.
actually be like, handling accounts and like doing all this stuff.
Customer relationships, things like that.
They had no idea what to do with me, and it's in many ways still don't, because it's never been a role before.
Mm-hmm.
And then the whole social stuff actually kind of grew out of, like my wanting to figure out something that I could do and not have to, directly report to everyone on every little detail, because in many ways what I'm doing with digital is a black box to many of the people where I'm at, because we're traditionally a PR agency, but that industry has been heavily disrupted. So now all PR agencies either are going to have to go the way of the dinosaurs or become integrated communication agencies, because the amount of companies asking for pure PR scopes of work is just disappearing. So like even now, if there's no, for example, like straight up media buying on the digital side, if there's no component of that, there's at least something around influencer marketing, or how is this going to drive social chatter online. So there's no just PR inquiries anymore. It's all this kind of new integrated communications space. But back when I started doing all this digital stuff, that wasn't really the case. So I was trying to carve out something for myself that I could, actually do, because I would never be as good at media relations or, writing a press release as a native Japanese person. My Japanese is basically near native level. I've never done the JLPT or anything like that, because I never really actually studied Japanese. I learned it just mainly through osmosis of being around people. But I mean, I can get by. I can do pitches in Japanese. I mean, you probably don't want me writing a press release, just as I wouldn't want any non-native doing a presentation for a multinational firm, but I'm good enough. And so
to navigating that environment, I think there's really a lot of learnings about how you were able to introduce these concepts to your company. For people, I know there are a lot of people out there, they're not necessarily travel bloggers, or they're not in marketing, but maybe they're, they can be in anything. Maybe they're in sales, maybe they're in health tech, maybe they're in law.
Right.
They can be in anything, and they're trying to look for new ways, or they're looking, or if they've seen success abroad and they've thought, maybe we could try this, and maybe it's in social media, maybe it's in something else. But this idea of introducing something to kind of like an existing system is is difficult. And so, like, as you mentioned, if we go back to the tapas analogy, of course, you can have like this kind of board of all different kinds of meats, but at the end of the day, exactly like that kind of tapas analogy, you're still hungry. No one's satisfied, right? And so if we start thinking about what are the kinds of things that you can do, like really is like tangible suggestions for people, that when you are coming up and you're at the same time you're appreciative and value and you value your employment, because there's many benefits that come with being employed, but at the same time you're encouraging the company to broaden their scope a little bit. Can you talk to us a little bit about some things that you learned along the way, maybe even things that worked well or things that didn't work so well, about encouraging a Japanese company to try new things?
So it's difficult, of course. I think a lot of it is micro A/B testing, and then getting things going, and then explaining that you're doing something that's working, rather than saying, can I try X, Y, Z? Because in many cases, the person who has the final authority, I don't know if you've ever seen like the Ringi show or whatnot. It's like as you go up in Hanko levels of like hierarchy, the person who's making the decision has less and less context about what they're deciding on in many cases. So like once we get to like Kaicho or Shacho level, it's like ours is different. Our case is a little bit different because we have a very young Shacho. He's in his mid-40s. But in many cases at a Japanese company, the Shacho is like 60 or even older and has like never touched social media in his life. So in many cases, it's so far outside of his reality that it's quite hard for him to approve something that he has no context on. So it becomes scary. And then he just, as a kind of default gut reaction, will say no. So a lot of cases, I found that it's best to even self-fund something for a little bit and then get it going, and then figure out how to, like, for example, make that back on the back end or something like that. Because otherwise it's not going to get going unless you kind of, basically be a black sheep in a certain sense, try something and then get some momentum going, and saying, hey, I've been doing this, it works, we've done, say, XYZ because of it, I'd like to build this out. Here's what I think can happen. Here is the projection of the numbers. I find that oftentimes a lot of executives really just only care about the numbers. Like, I could be selling ice cream on the street, and if it's bringing in money, they're going to be fine with it. It's literally, it comes down to just like, what are the numbers? What are the numbers? What are the numbers? Mm-hmm. And then, like, what is mitigating any sort of risk? So, like, for example, I think one reason why our board is okay with me basically being the mouthpiece of all of our social media is that they know that I have a track record in it, and I have context on it on both brand and agency side. So I kind of know how to thread that line. And because, I mean, in many instances, is being, for example, if you're a monolingual board members, you have no way of vetting whether what I put out in terms of like our monthly columns or on our own social media accounts, there's no way of vetting if that's going to work, because you don't have the context of an overseas audience. So I think developing trust is really important, and then also just doing those micro tests, and then also being kind of being a bit of a rogue at the same time.
That idea of being a kind of a data-driven rogue, right? Because that's kind of
exactly
why you've been able to build this relationship, or you've been able to have this position in your company for almost a decade now, right? They wouldn't, if you were just a rogue. Japanese are very quick to cast you aside, if you're just a troublemaker. But if you're that kind of like data-driven explorer, that's a different model. Right. So one thing that a parallel that I see in my work to yours is that we work in sprints, which is kind of short, deliverables, and kind of it's similar to what you do in the sense that you have campaigns, right? And then the campaigns grow. And I found that not having this, one big Las Vegas bet kind of model that, okay, well, let's take, as you mentioned, A/B testing, but then let's also deliver it in an agile way. Maybe it's in a sprint, maybe it's in sprints, maybe it's in campaigns. I've also found that successful in terms of gaining that stakeholder buy-in and securing that next budget. So instead of turning up and saying, I need a budget for 10 campaigns, scale it back a bit and say, okay, this is my plan for the first one. Obviously, our plan is North Star is in 10 campaigns will be here, but that kind of sprint mentality I found has been successful in getting that investment that's been required, both financial investment, but also the stakeholder backing. How's it been for you?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that especially when it comes to a Japanese company, is get a very, very small, consequential budget and then over deliver on results. So, I mean, with a very, very small budget, I think I 4x our traffic in the last year to our website, as well as leads. So it's like with an inconsequential budget, like not even a person's salary level budget. So that kind of has given me a lot of leg room to be able to maybe potentially ask for more down the line, and build out some other areas that we desperately need but haven't been able to build out yet, just because people haven't been able to see how the numbers work.
And that's what it's about, right? It's really about translating, that vision that you have into something tangible, so that then you can go and deliver and say, okay, this is what we believe in, or this could be the next step. If we take that kind of like as our model, and we think about storytelling, and we think about what does it mean to tell a story in Japan, and kind of why do so many people get it wrong, right? And it's not just
Hmm.
simply, the foreigners coming to Japan and translating an English thing into Japanese, but as you
Hmm.
mentioned, the Japanese themselves are also missing many opportunities to tell a really compelling story. Particularly, if we think about, maybe one of the best things that happened to Japan was that the Olympics was delayed by a year, because then at least a few museums might be able to review, their
Right.
content strategy, right? Because, I think, going to, I very much enjoy on the weekends, going to
Hmm.
museums and things like that. And you think that, you have this brochure in your hand, which is, has the tiniest, text, you can barely read it. And if you actually read it and you kind of dissect what it means, it's actually a really impressive thing that you're looking at. But because the storytelling is just so painful, you just shut off,
Right.
right?
Yep.
What's Talk to us a little bit about storytelling in Japan, what they, what's not working so well, but also what maybe we could try.
Okay, so one thing is, before even storytelling, you need someone's attention to be able to tell them a story. And I find at that moment, a lot of people get shut out. For example, as you mentioned, in all of these flyers, either at any sort of sightseeing spot, at a museum, they're packed full of information. A lot of people, especially, for example, foreign tourists, don't want a piece of paper that they now have to carry, and there's no trash bins to throw them in anyway. So now they're stuck with this pamphlet that they have to carry around for the next hour, especially in summer. It's like you put it in your pocket and now it's like stuck to your back. Like, no one wants that experience. It's almost like a disservice that you're giving this thing to people, rather than you just like, figuring out a better way to
Ruins my
tell.
experience, then
Right.
increase it.
I was just in Hyogo Prefecture not too long ago, and I remember hiking up a mountain to go to this like mountaintop temple enclave, and being past a flyer as soon as I got there. Like, I'm dripping with sweat from
You're
climbing
like,
up a mountain.
no, thank
Like,
you.
here's this
No,
flyer.
thank you. No, thank you.
And it was something like I wanted the information on it too, but I just knew that, one, there's not going to be any trash bins up here for me to throw it out later. And
Is
it's like,
hilarious, because anyone that has, been to Japan, has traveled Japan, knows the rubbish bin thing is
yeah,
so real. It's so real. Okay, so you're at the mountaintop. I'm gonna say,
right.
here's your flyer. You're like, no.
No, I'm good. I'm good. I don't need it. And I wanted the information, but I just figured that most of it would be online later. I could go look it up. So there's, first of
Ew.
all, you need someone's attention. So like
Right.
I would have been the type of person to be very receptive to the content there. Um, as my friends would jokingly say, there's a lot of Donny things in there. But I just didn't take the flyer, and read up on it later on the bus ride back. So first of all, you need people's attention. Once you have their attention, then you have a chance to tell them their story. I find that in a lot of Japanese storytelling, that it's fact, 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 fact. And if you understand what each of those facts are, you can extrapolate what the story is. However, if you don't know what
Right.
any of those facts
Yeah.
are, the story all of a sudden disappears. And this problem is even further exacerbated when you come to something like inbound tourism, where someone would probably be really interested in the story, but as soon as those facts no longer hold any significance, just due to lack of context, then the entire significance of the place just disappears.
But
This is
that,
why I
that
actually use an overseas editor whenever I write my content, who has very little context on Japan, because they help me pick out things that I would not otherwise pick out. My favorite example of this that makes it really easy to understand is, do you know Taiyu Inbyo, up in Nikko? There's the Toshoku
I've
Shrine,
been.
right? And
I've never
right
been.
next to it is Iemitsu's mausoleum. So Iemitsu being the grandson of Tokugawa Ieyasu. She couldn't follow the difference between
A
those two.
shogun of Japan.
So I ended up going first shogun, third shogun, rather than using their names, because it was too hard to follow from a foreign perspective. But even I felt kind of victim to that trap of, like, just assuming the reader knew this fact. So I mean, basically, you need to know your audience. You need to know their level of contextual understanding, and then weave a story that gives them enough information that they can follow along, but not too much that it's like, here's a dictionary of facts about sensoji. No one needs that.
But I love it, because there's actually one more point that you do that we didn't mention, which was the testing, right? Which was test, go and get
Yeah.
feedback. And this is something that traditionally in Japan isn't. isn't as smooth as in other areas where you do something and there's
Right.
this kind of obsession with yoku dekimashita, ganbarimashita, this kind of, like unnecessary like cheerism.
Right.
And then, if it doesn't work, then there's like this, then there's a complete shame, and then you're like, well,
Right.
why couldn't we have had feedback as the middle step? So we didn't go from being a cheerleader to being, death by shame. Like surely,
Hmm.
we can check in with our audience. So obviously, checking in with your audience and knowing your audience is one thing, but then also what you did so intelligently was to go and then test it with someone, because they'll often give it to other Japanese people to read. What do you think about this? Oh yeah, ine, ine. Well,
Right.
what would you know about what a foreigner is looking at?
Yeah. Right. So I mean, I have to vet any of the, for example, right now I think we're kind of crossing lines a bit in terms of my own content, which I think that's what I was mentioning about having an outside editor. But for the B2B kind of content that I write, of course I have to get approval from when I throw it on a corporate site. But that just ends up usually being a verbal process of being like, this is what I'm going to write. This is the goal. This is the keyword that I'm going after. So for example, as soon as I'm done with this call, I'm going to be dropping an article about e-commerce marketing, which is a code I've cracked lately, and I've been driving 20 return on ad spends for many of my clients lately. So that means for every yen they're spending, they're making 20 yen back. But I'm going to drop a master class on that that's like 4,000 words long, going after the keyword of Japan e-commerce. I've already done this for influencer marketing. I'm #1 result in Google if you search Japan influencer marketing. So of course I need their approval there, but a lot, like you said, a lot of this is just kind of like A/B testing, and none of us know what's going to work. That's kind of where I start with digital marketing, is we don't know anything and we don't know what's going to work. Let's try things. And I think that's very kind of counter to the Japan monozukuri type of approach to craftsmanship and some sort of way of doing something. And I think that's a place where Japan struggles, is they try to do a good execution from the get-go rather than just throwing everything at the wall and letting the data kind of guide you.
About, as you mentioned, one of the things that you've, if you think about you, that kind of attached to your name is that kind of growth hacker, right? That you've been able to go in, get in the, go through the weeds, get in the mud, work out, what's going on, and then create, a meaningful, or even like an obvious process out of it. And, so many people have for so long been, wondering about influencer marketing or wondering about e-commerce. And, after your trial and error, you're able to kind of emerge with what, you then only afterwards say, well, it wasn't that obvious. Well, it wasn't obvious at the time, though, and it wasn't obvious, but you were able to do that. Can you, and I know that the article will actually would have dropped. So if you're dropping it today, it'll drop before this podcast is released. But maybe you can talk to us, if you can't mention about what it is exactly about what the e-commerce strategies are. I'd love to hear about that. But if you can't talk about that, I would love to hear more about what your process has been in order to kind of break down that kind of modular approach to understanding like a more of a complex topic.
The processes are many. So for example, with influencer marketing, a lot of what I've come to understand is being one of the only people that I actually know who's on both sides of the equation. That I get a lot of by brand I mean destinations, requesting me to do tie-up features on their locations, or invitations to press tours. Now, normally an agency person is on the organizing side of that press tour equation. So they have their own kind of goals, presuppositions, biases, and whatnot in mind when coming up with that schedule. A lot of times people on the influencer side are only on the influencer side of things and don't understand that, hey, a brand is paying not just your fee, but flights, hotels, transportation, all these things to make this whole thing happen. So they're trying to make the content that works for them. But in reality, the best kind of partnership is in the middle, and it was in a way that works for the influencer's brand, but also drives results for whoever's paying. I found that by being in the middle, I've been able to see what works, what doesn't work, and what you need to be really careful of. And I've also been able to, learned from what I can only describe as god-awful execution by a lot of local destinations, just from an influencer marketing perspective. Like, no offense to them, they were basically told probably by someone, go organize an influencer tour, that they probably didn't at that point even know what an Instagrammer or YouTuber was. And then now are all of a sudden tasked with this. But looking back on, like, for example, the itinerary, the ask, with what I know now, I could point out so many things wrong with it. So one of my favorite examples was we went to, do you know what karakuri ningyo are? They're basically like Edo period automatons. You can wind them up and they'll do like, they're basically proto robots in many senses. We get to go see
if they go off like when you're sleeping.
Yeah,
like most Japanese dolls.
they're a little creepy, but like the ones I saw could shoot a bow and arrow. There's another one could do calligraphy, and another one could serve tea, which is pretty cool. But anyway, we got to see a 10th generation karakuri ningyo master as part of a fam tour or a press tour. And then I asked the pertinent question, where can my readers see this? Oh, they can't. Then why was it on our itinerary? And they're like, oh, we just wanted you to experience it. And it's like, okay, great. The highlight of the tour, even if I introduce it as a piece of content, is useless. It basically equates to bragging on my end. Like, hey, I did this cool thing that none of you can do. So I actually used that post when teaching people about influencer marketing, because I review my own posts and I go through why it's absolutely atrocious execution. There's no account that we're tagging. So basically all of that attention is instantly lost as someone scrolls through their feed. 2, there's no set hashtag, so you can't see other places, other people's content that were on that tour as well. There's no geotagging. You can't even see these things to begin with. So there's nothing to geotag, but like no one even knows where this is. Like it's like a cool tidbit of information that has no lead up. And that came about because whoever ended up organizing this tour, again, no offense to them, they did their best, just had no context about the entire, like they probably never used Instagram before. They don't understand that people use Instagram like this and they scroll through their feed as fast as they can. And then if you can't stop someone in like a fraction of a second with a post, then you've lost them. In that scrolling kind of culture, if you don't have a hook that then links to your own account or something to, move the conversation forward, then you've lost their attention in that 1 second. So someone might even think that Karakuri Ningyo post was cool, and then they scrolled past, and 5 minutes later they can't remember it. I think we have like less attention now than goldfish. I think goldfish have 8 seconds of total attention. I think the average human attention span right now is down to 6 or 7.
Oh my gosh!
So I mean, like
imagine.
that's what we're dealing with. And like, if you think people are going to have recall about like Karakuri Ningyo even 5 minutes later, you're crazy. So that's why in that instant, you need to have some sort of link to a good execution would link to the place. If it would either link to the prefecture, if that was the person organizing it, it would link to the place where these Karakuri Ningyo could be seen. It would have some kind of link that people could then, if they're interested, go and follow. And then you in that activation, the person who's paying all this money can siphon some of that attention off of the influencers and take some of their following and then put it onto whatever account they're trying to promote. So a lot of the things that I've learned is basically been through kind of being in the trenches myself and now analyzing my own experience and then figuring out how I would kind of respond to an ask like that. So for example, in the kind of diatribe I just went through, I would understand that we want to have some sort of geotagging or something that people can then look more into the destination and learn more about it than just a one-off piece of intriguing content. And then I would infuse that into the way that I work with influencers and whatnot.
I have another question for you.
Sure.
How do you not lose your mind when you are really pushing the boundaries and you're really at the edge of new technologies and you're at the edge of new content and new platforms? and you have to come back. And as I heard in one of your stories, you had to explain to somebody what a sharp was when you said, you mean a hashtag? And then they said, yeah. Can you tell us about that? Can you tell us what and how those kinds of things about how you don't lose your mind in this context of being at the forefront of innovation and then trying to deliver it in Japan when sometimes it's like knocking on deaf ears?
You assume I'm not losing my mind.
Okay, that's a good point.
It drives me crazy. And so this gets to, I think, where Japan is, again, in one of those weird situations where reality is going one way and the Japanese cultural tropes is going another way. Is more and more all of our collective attention is converging on like 10 platforms, right? So for music, we have Spotify. For video content, we have Netflix. There's like 10 or so platforms that all of our collective attention is on. And as more and more attention gets put on these platforms, it becomes increasingly important to understand how they work. Because if you don't do that, you basically, again, to going back to the storytelling thing, you first need their attention. If you don't understand where the attention is and how that works, you can't tell a story. So one of my favorite things that's going on right now is, Japanese media are generally put on a pedestal and said, like, this is like the highest echelon of trust. What's happening is everyone's consuming content within the dedicated apps of curation sites. So like Big Globe or Gunosi, they all have apps, and everyone's reading it through those apps. They're not even going to the media anymore. They're just reading what bubbles up on curation sites. So understanding all this is really important. However, there's no stick in Japanese corporate culture in many senses. So there's no like, I'm going to lose my job if I don't perform. There's also no reward in many cases. Like, I'm the type of person who I just need it for my own mental stimulation. Otherwise, I would go crazy. It's like, I need to be finding out new things. I need to be continually pushing my skill set as hard as it can go. Otherwise, I just get really, really bored. And that's when things start to go kind of dark. As long as like I'm like, as long as I'm like researching, okay, like how many hashtags can I put before I start seeing a drop off in impressions? As long as I'm like doing that and trying to figure that out through trial and error, I'm fine, and I'm very engaged. As soon as it becomes, another daily task, I get kind of really bored really quickly. But going back to what I was saying is there's no destructive kind of forces right now in the Japanese economy, both on the employee level and also on the company level. So a lot of companies who just like there's no disruption to them, so they continue to do things the way that they were. There's no need to be better, and there's no even if you do perform better in many cases, it's like, okay, here's good job. Here that's now your work. There's no further compensation other than like a good job, boy, attaboy, good job. Go do it again and bring in more money. So I think Japan really needs that carrot and stick, and to maybe readdress the fact that some kind of, destructive fire in terms of, people's employment might actually lead to innovation, because in many cases that comes out of a necessity, and unless you engineer the need to perform, then people just default to the path of least resistance.
I are working in kind of the two top buzzwords of Japan right now, right? Innovation on my side, and then,
Right.
social media on your side. And so, but there's a reason that despite the stonewalling that we get and the no's and the difficulties and the challenges, we're still there, right? We're still in Japan,
Right.
and we're still trying hard. Tell us why Japan has won your energy and your attention.
In many cases, there's no other option for me. I've been here for so long, I don't know anything else. The rest of the world doesn't make sense to me. I might look like a someone from descending from American parentage, but in many cases, I have no idea what's going on in the country for which I hold a passport. I don't watch any of the pop culture on TV or whatnot. I have no idea what's going on in drama. I don't watch football or anything. Like, I have no idea what's going on in that market, in terms of like having my finger on like pop cultural beat. I've never driven a car, ever. I usually either walk or take the train to all the places I go to. So yeah, like I have no idea how I'd even operate. I don't even know how to pay my own taxes over there or anything like that. So so it's kind of just like, it's just home for me. Life makes sense here in a weird sort of way that it's surprising that it does, but it does.
I can fully relate, when people, also say, of all the places that you could have chosen to go, why did you choose Japan? And it is difficult. It is difficult to, sum up in a sentence, but there is something that, connects you to the land despite the challenges. And if we think kind of, on looking to the future, so obviously we know the challenges, we know the problem to be solved, in front of us. But can you talk to us maybe about the things that you see as potential or opportunities, or even things that you feel positive about for Japan in the next, let's say, 18 months to kind of 5 years? What are you excited about for Japan?
So I think a lot of the people who went through the traditional corporate type of mentality training that was present in Japan's economic recovery are slowly fading out. And in their place are people who either were born in the lost decade or slightly before that, or who, don't want to be the iconic Tanaka-san of Maru Corporation. And they're willing to try new things. For the time being, I think they're getting stonewalled by people who lack context. So, for example, a lot of management right now might not use Instagram themselves or use any of the technology that's out there, but they understand its importance, but they're also a little bit afraid of it. I think as more and more people who kind of have grown up as smartphone natives end up taking up positions of power, a lot of things will start to change, as they'll have a bit more context on their own behavior and then be able to translate that into what they're doing. And at the flip side, I think the kind of lag between things happening in the world and them taking shape in Japan, that lead time is drastically dropping. One of the things is most, I'd say, not talked about in Japan is the bubbling entrepreneur scene. There's all sorts of, very small early stage startups who, are scrapping to get by. But there are a lot of people who are hungry and willing to try something new out there. I think society as a whole is not ready for that yet. And they end up getting kind of sidelined in many senses. But that culture is certainly changing. If anyone thinks that Japan isn't changing, I suggest you go stare at a glacier for a little bit and you'll see the same rate of change, which means barely perceptible, but it's there. And then next thing you know it, like cashless payments are the norm in Japan, which has now happened. Like everyone's paying with Suica, PayPay, or whatnot. And that happened literally over the course of 2 years, but it was very slow and gradual. And similar things are happening all over the place. For example, one thing I've noticed within at least the agency where I'm at is how quickly Instagrammers went from something we don't do, or influencers in general, to now being like the go-to thing that everyone now has to do. So, and then what's funny is because where I'm at now in terms of my understanding, I actually am more and more moving towards the opinion, not entirely 100% there yet, but I'm more moving towards the mindset where it doesn't make sense to work with Instagrammers if an Instagram post is your only deliverable. And that's because what's happening is, and this is one of those things that I've just kind of reverse engineered from being on the platform, is that organic reach is slowly dropping. So that's the number of people you reach without paying, is slowly dropping month over month. And what I think, and only the Zuckerbot knows what's really going on. But I think what the parent company Facebook is trying to do is slowly limit the reach of big accounts such that it becomes more effective to just pay Instagram for advertising than it does to pay a content creator to reach their audience. And when this same process happened on Facebook, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, is when organic reach really started plummeting. It's right now below 1% on average. So if you have 1 million followers, you're only going to reach 10,000 of them. That's kind of crazy. So it means that basically anyone who invested in building a big audience on Facebook now has a worthless asset in many cases. But when the same process happened on Facebook, a lot of people, understandably very angry because they had invested in growing this very large audience and now they had to pay to reach that audience. So I think what's happening right now, and part of the hiding of likes was a way to mask this, is that they're slowly dropping the organic reach in a way that they can make advertising more economical. So that's something I've understood from being kind of, at the forefront of all of this. And then now I tell that to our staff, you just got us all doing Instagrammers. Now you want us to do not do Instagrammers? What is it? So it's kind of confusing. It's I don't think Japan is ready for the rate at which all these platforms are changing. Just a year ago, TikTok wasn't really a thing, and now it's the number one most downloaded platform in the world.
Mm-hmm. And they're like, "Gosh, Donny, you just told us Instagram. Gosh."
Right. Yeah.
But if we take a look at this, there's so much that I appreciate about your story, which is that if we're really looking to leverage or to grow or to bring value to anyone or anything, it needs to be driven really by two things. It really has to be driven by that empathy for who we're working with, right? And you've been able to do that in a really unique way. As you mentioned, you've had not only
sometimes
but you've had the agency perspective, but then you've also had the influencers perspective, whereas the influencers are why aren't they doing this and this for us, and and kind of complaining, and then you'll have the agency complaining, why are they asking for these things, and you can kind of see, okay, well, any kind of request or any kind of ask that we come with, it's really got to be driven by a business potential. It's got to be driven by a business decision, and to have that empathy for both sides is super important. And then also one thing that on the other side, it's to take that empathy and to take those insights and then test them, which really requires that mindset of openness, that, we don't have all the answers, but guess what?
Right.
It's also okay, that we don't have the answers. And this is one thing that, we hope to do also with our work in Japan, in innovation, is to create that learning mindset, that it's okay to learn. You don't have to, it's launch and learn, right? It's not always,
right.
Launch and, we're fine. And if we were to wrap this up, I would be so interested to know what is next for you as a person. What's next for you?
It's a good question. So I've been trying to, and very much struggling to figure out how to create means to be more effective in being able to take all of the things that I've now come to understand and implement them in campaigns and in activations and in client work and in my own stuff as well. Because the more I learn, to be honest, I realize how little I actually know, and that scares me. So for example, I literally just went down a rabbit hole 2 weeks ago about all of this new stuff in terms of what are called Facebook lead ads. And I had never really done that before, because I've never really been in a position to be drumming up B2B business for a client. That I just never had that learning opportunity. And then now that I just found this rabbit hole I went down, I'm like, oh my God, I knew nothing about this space. So the more I learn, the more I realize how even far I'm behind. And that terrifies me. But trying to take all of that, what I'm understanding and learning, and then being able to effectively implement it, because at the end of the day, I'm a non-native speaker of Japanese. I can't write copy. I'm not a 20-year-old Japanese female who has, the cultural upbringings and the kind of the context of being a 20-year-old female in Japanese. So a lot of, for example, whenever doing social, I found Japanese staff are like, I don't know what to do, therefore I'm not going to do it, rather than like, let's just give this a try. So a lot of times what I end up having to do is coming up with the type of content we're going to make for clients, which is fine, but I've found that there's a slight disconnect there because being, that I'm not 100% culturally Japanese, there's a little bit of a schism between the things that I naturally think of and what I say 22-year-old Japanese first year at a company thinks. So that ends up not getting infused into the content, right? So maybe there's like, for example, words that demographic uses. Maybe there's sort of certain types of, popular trends in that demographic that I'm just not following because, again, I'm not like, I don't have enough time to just sit there and follow what 20-year-old Japanese girls are talking about on Twitter for the entire day. But without someone who really is in that space, it becomes really hard to produce what I would call top tier quality. So being able to replicate what I'm able to do in terms of what I call Donny things, which is like really weird topics like Shinbutsu Shugo or the syncretic union of Shinto and Buddhism, which is like, for some reason, just fascinates me. I don't know why. It's like, why am I interested in this country's like syncretic religious roots? I have no idea, but you know what?
I am, and that's it.
Yeah, right. It kind of like it confuses people sometimes. I remember really confusing this one poor shrine maiden when I was asking about like this really deep concept. She's like, why is this white guy interested?
She's like, please
but
leave.
anyway, just please leave. I don't even know this.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I'm just here till 3. Please come back.
Yes.
Later.
But I don't have someone in Japanese who can, really replicate that level of nuance. And that's really what I've been trying to struggle is whether to not I build out a team and then have to move away from like having my hands in the dirt and then being a manager of people, because I'm much more, to use it like for example, just a military metaphor, I'm much more the sniper than the general. I don't really want to be in like, okay, now I have to manage a team of 5, but to really be more effective, I think that's one of the things I'm probably have to go into challenge next, because otherwise I'm limited by the fact that I'm operating in a country where I'm not entirely native and can't really just bang out perfect prose that speaks to my target audience.
Right, and I love this because you've recognized what you can do, recognize what you can't do, what you can't,
right.
And then you've just been able to bring value to your clients in a different way. And someone once said to me, bring expertise, not Japanese, right? And
right.
So speaking Japanese certainly helps us in building, client relationships and managing stakeholders and things like
right.
that. But our real value is not, our near native Japanese. It's really that
right.
ability to think differently, but also appreciate the context, of Japan at the same time.
Yeah, I think it helps to be able to identity bend, like being able to go, okay, I know
that identity bend. I'm
going to be like.
You've coined a term for me now. I love it. Identity bend. Yeah, keep going.
I just came up with that one on the fly, but
yeah, no, I love it.
Being able to like gaijin smash when something needs to be smashed.
Yes, done.
And then being able to like do the Japanese role when that's most effective. Right. And being able to, play both sides of that, I think is really important. It's probably where most people who are in similar positions to us can be most effective, because at the end of the day, we're not, Japanese people, and probably we won't be doing the final product of something. We'll be working with people who then produce the final product. So being able to get them to do something, but then also, getting the go ahead for them to be able to even be in a position to do something is where I think a lot of what we can do comes into play.
Donny, we're in for an exciting time, and I can't thank you enough for the time that you've taken today to share your insights, and to really go through some of these topics, with a really candid lens. So I appreciate your learnings, and
no problem.
Please come back and join us anytime on the Business Karaoke Podcast. Thank you so much for coming.
Sure, it might be great to connect again after the Olympics or something, once we see how or if that changes Japan in some sort of drastic way.
I'll be watching like the glacier.
All right, take care.